Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you so much to everybody for coming this afternoon. And a big happy Father's Day to all the dads in the audience. Thanks for making the time to come along. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We extend this respect to any First Nations people joining us today. Mulligan's Flat Woodland Sanctuary is Australia's largest single box gum grassy woodland area and a stunning piece of bushland. It has been cared for by the first peoples of this region for millennia, and we're really grateful for that. This is the third town hall event that Senator Pocock is holding this year. We've been running these events for a couple of years now, in fact a little bit more, and they've been a fantastic way to hear firsthand from people in the community about what matters most to you. With the ACT elections coming up on the 19th of October, there's a lot to talk about in terms of local issues, and it's a great opportunity to hear from you about your vision for Canberra and what David can advocate for at a federal level to make that happen. Over the past week, David's been inviting the community to submit your questions over Slido. While you can't, after the formal proceedings close, oh yes, great. We thought we didn't have the QR code, but we do. That's great news. So you can't submit new questions now, but what you can do is scan the QR code behind you and you can upvote questions that you'd like to see answered. You may need to enter a code. The code is Pocock24. After the formal proceedings close, we're very lucky to have the opportunity for an up-close encounter with an eastern bettong, one of our most unique native animals resident here at the Woodlands, Mulligan Flat Woodland Sanctuary. Keely from the Wildbark team will facilitate this. So if you haven't booked, come and have a chat with us afterwards because there's a few sessions. The crew from Electrify Canberra will also be outside at the pergola cooking up a storm. So we'll head out there to continue the conversation after proceedings close. Without further ado, Senator David Pocock.
Thank you, Tash. And thank you all so much for joining us on a Sunday afternoon. And yes, happy Father's Day to all the fathers out there. I remembered at about 9 a.m. to give my dad a call. So off the hook. I was really keen to use this as a slightly more informal town hall to really try and hear from you about local issues. We obviously are pushing a bunch of things federally, and there's always crossover, and a lot of the issues that my office hears about are local territory issues. We advocate where we can. I work on the federal angle where we can. We write letters, but unfortunately we just can't deal with all of them. And I'll give a bit of an update soon, but I guess the priorities that are up on the wall in the office at the moment are housing, cost of living, health, my duty of care bill and environmental law reform, as well as increasing funding. Gambling reform, I think we've got a real window of time to make something happen there. Electoral reform, same thing. Electoral reform was promised, but we haven't seen anything. We've got a federal election coming up. And then the last one is scams, which we've been doing more and more work on. But a little bit of an update in the last 2 weeks of Parliament. I had a motion to ban gambling advertising in line with the Murphy review, and we had a good debate on that, and then the major parties voted against it. Basically, the whole crossbench is in support of the Murphy review. We had a couple of nationals across the floor on that one. There was a CFMEU bill that passed, NDIS bill that passed, deepfake bill that also passed, Net Zero Economy Authority, climate disclosures bills, and then there was a public service amendment bill. We had a couple of great events. Been doing some work with community legal centres and some of the others on the crossbench, Zoe Daniel, really to try and get better funding for community legal. They're turning away 1,000 people a week. And if you think about the kind of society that we want to live in, I think access to legal representation is critical. And so many people who just have nowhere to turn, you talk to community legal centres, and for them to turn them away is heartbreaking. And so I think there's a real need for the state and territory and the federal government to step up in that area. And then we had an electrification showcase. A shout out to Electrify Canberra for being there. We had Saul Griffith, the head of Arena, a bunch of really impressive speakers to talk about some of the really, I guess, exciting opportunities, but hard challenges when it comes to electrification around things like retrofitting apartments, charging infrastructure on the street, a whole range of issues. There's no shortage of committee work in the Senate. I was on the Middle Arm inquiry, which handed down its report. There's the Environment Protection Australia inquiry. It's the new EPA that the government's setting up. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The international student caps bill is still going sort of through the Senate committee process. I've got some real concerns about the way that the government is doing it. We can also talk about that later. Then there's the Future Made in Australia inquiry. We had a couple last week, and I think there's potentially one more. And then the Select Committee on Artificial Intelligence that I'm on, that's sort of an ongoing process, and pretty eye-opening to hear from experts about where AI is likely to go. And this is one thing that I've found really fascinating, because you have industry and business in the room and it's all upside. AI is great, it's going to transform the economy, huge opportunities. And then you have experts and people in the community, and they say, yeah, that's cool, it might do that, but it could also have disastrous consequences, and we want to make sure that we are guarding against that we have some guardrails against sort of the worst uses. And one of the ones I've been focusing on is AI in elections, the use of deepfakes, so AI-generated video, voice clones, and currently we have no laws to stop that at all. And we know that when it comes to elections, you can basically say whatever you want, have some authorization at the end, and it's totally legal. So that's something we're pushing the government on and hoping to do a bit more in the next few weeks. Hopefully you see something in the next few weeks. Right, so we've talked about the high-risk AI. Been pushing the government to legislate on scams. It's something that they promised, and they're sort of dragging it out a bit. The Aged Care Act, this will be a major party deal. My understanding is that the major parties are getting close to coming to some sort of agreement on what that's going to look like going forward. And then, disappointingly in housing, there's a bit of a logjam with the Build to Rent bill, which I'll also talk about a bit later. The Help to Buy scheme, which is basically a fairly small, but I think potentially important scheme to help young people who don't have wealthy parents access the bank of mum and dad, essentially, for the government to take equity. And then there'll be the next tranche of NDIS reform. I voted for the NDIS reform. I acknowledge that there were a number of NDIS participants and their families, I think, who are still incredibly nervous about what these changes mean. And for me, it was really weighing up that with trying to make, and potentially voting against the bill, versus trying to actually make this bill slightly better, because it was going through anyway, and really committing to the, I guess, disability sector in the ACT, that I'll continue to work with them as the delegated legislation and the next tranche of legislation comes through. And I'm happy to talk a bit more about that later. And then the last one is EPBC reform. Being here at Mulligan's Flat, I think this is such an incredible example of what is possible when it comes to conservation, reintroducing locally extinct species. The eastern bettong has been extinct on the mainland for a very long time. someone from Mulligan's can tell me, but I'm guessing near on 100 years. 100 years. And they're back. They're back here on our doorstep. The government committed to environmental law reform. Our laws are totally broken, and they've recently kicked that down the road beyond the next election. We're hearing that Western Australia and the mining lobby put the hard word on them, and instead they're offering up Environment Protection Australia, which would be a sort of environment protection agency. In its current form, I have no interest in voting for it. It's just essentially another bureaucracy that'll oversee broken environmental laws. And so really keen to push them, if they are going to get their EPA through, that they actually amend some of the broken laws. Here we get to the ACT. Hear far too much from Canberrans about healthcare. It's obviously a huge pain point for people who are trying to access a GP. We've got the lowest number of GPs per capita, this will be no surprise. The highest gap fees, lowest bulk billing rate. And then, the thing that people say to me in estimates is, oh, well, Canberrans are wealthy. You've got the highest rate of public, private health insurance. And sure, that may be true, but obviously there's a lot of people in Canberra doing it tough. But even if you have private health insurance, we're getting totally dudded. We're being charged up to 10 times, even higher, more for elective surgeries. And a lot of Canberrans are having to travel to Sydney or elsewhere. So obviously infrastructure investment, the ACT getting a better share of Commonwealth funding. Housing, continue to talk to the government about the CSIRO Ginninderra site. There's the Social Housing Accelerator Fund. It was $50 million given to the ACT government on a 2-year use-it-or-lose-it basis. I've met with Yvette Berry, the housing minister. I'm really concerned that the ACT government isn't moving fast enough. If they don't use this, they're going to lose it. And we've heard that other states are really getting their act together and leveraging that with community housing providers and making it go a lot further. Unfortunately, that's not what I'm hearing they see, but they've still got time to deliver on that. And then the Housing Australia Future Fund, round 1. This is the future fund the government set up to deliver 30,000 social and affordable homes. And in round 1, community housing providers put in essentially bids for 50,000. And so there's clearly the ability to build more, and what myself and a bunch of other crossbenchers have been saying to the government is that they could double the fund and actually get cracking on social and affordable housing. What's next? Right, we'll go to questions now. We might start with Slido while people have a couple of minutes to think. Is yours working?
Hello. Sorry, folks.
So we're just reading them out for people online.
Yeah. There's been a bit of debate around the size of the public service, with Peter Dutton committing a coalition government to cutting jobs. What do you think of this?
Well, we saw the Morrison government cut the public service and say we're saving money, and then spend an exorbitant amount on consultants and outsourcing what really should be public service roles. And so I think it's frankly ridiculous to think that that's a way to save money. And you talk to people who are trying to access Centrelink, and we've been out to the call centre and just seen the amount of time that people are having to wait. It's unacceptable. People, I think, want and deserve better services than that, and that actually requires people on the other end of the phone, and they are public servants. And so I think I'm really keen to try and help change the narrative around public servants. These are people who are actually serving us and providing the services that people get really cranky when they can't get them across the country. And the majority of the public service isn't even in Canberra. I think that's one thing that I try and remind my colleagues in the Senate. And so we'll obviously be pushing back against that. I think it's, it might fly in Queensland and WA where you can sort of punch down on Canberra, but I'd hope that we have a better, I think most Australians are smarter than that, so we've just got to keep pushing back.
Next most popular question. The education funding system is a mess at best. It is economically profligate and socially divisive. What actions are you pursuing during the current debate?
Yeah, this is it's obviously something that the Jason Clare, the Education Minister, is busy negotiating new funding agreements with the states and territories. What I'm hearing from headmasters, teachers, the teachers union here in the ACT, we're at 100% of the sort of Gonski model of funding, and even that isn't enough. If you talk to teachers about the amount that they are having to do, obviously there's a bunch of states that are well below 100%, and that needs to be fixed. But yeah, really trying to get the government to actually lift their ambition when it comes to education, both in the way that we actually value teachers, but the way that we fund public schools. I'm not actually allowed to go to public schools in the ACT. The minister and the director, I think, have turned me down about 7 times now. But I do get to talk to some of the leaders in there. And last week, 2 weeks ago in Parliament, I actually met with a bunch of people from the NTEU and some of the headmasters, and just hearing what a challenge it is. And so I'm hopeful that the government's going to remove, currently there's a 22% legislated cap on how much they can give public schools. I think that needs to go, and we actually need to fund public schools to ensure that every child has a world-class education. And so as the sort of legislation to actually do that comes through, I'm sure myself and a heap of others on the crossbench will be pushing this, because I know it matters so much to Canberrans. I think people across the country. Sure, if you choose to send your child to a private school, or non-government school, that's fine. But if you go to a public school in Australia, you should get a world-class education, regardless of which state or territory you're in.
So we might go to some questions from people in the room now. Just throw your hands up if you wanted to talk about anything in particular.
If we're talking about the size of the public service, is there any activity to get rid of the efficiency dividend?
I've had some good battles at Senate estimates over the efficiency dividend. For the really big departments, I can see the argument, but when it comes to some of the smaller ones, I just think there's absolutely no reason to have the efficiency dividend. And certainly when you're getting down to the size of, say, the culture institutions, the only way you become more efficient is to cut staff. But maybe we can chat afterwards. I'd be interested to hear, when it comes to like the bigger departments, how you think how that plays out. Do you want to say anything else on it, or? Yeah, cool.
Just a quick one. Is there any chance of the Senate having a look at the so-called cashless society and the fact that we keep getting hit with surcharges, which I think is up around $5 billion this last financial year? It's just another way to rip us off. How much does it cost to maintain an algorithm?
This is something else I hear a bit from people concerned about, either people not taking cash, or, as you said, not being able to pay cash but then getting slugged to actually use your card. I think there's some really really poor examples. So Access Canberra won't take won't take cash. I've spoken to people who work with homeless Canberrans who don't have a bank card, and so there's no way for them to go actually pay to get a driver's license. Charities are having to give them preloaded credit cards essentially. So there is some work being done through there's an inquiry looking into banking. I haven't followed it that closely. I assume they'll be looking at charges. And I know Bob Catter is on a crusade when it comes to people having to take legal tender. I can certainly find out what the latest is there on that federally.
I might ask a question from online now. How can we better support the homeless and those on the public housing list in the ACT?
Well, I think there's short, medium, long-term stuff. The number one thing is just the availability of social housing in the ACT. We've seen no sort of meaningful increase as the population has increased. We've seen a whole heap of social housing in the inner north be sold off, not replaced at the same rate. And when you talk to people, actually sometimes built out away from where services are. I don't think that's a great way to go. The other thing is funding organisations who are working with homeless people, having wraparound services that can actually help people get back on their feet. And this is again another big issue. Frontline service organisations haven't seen a meaningful increase in funding, I think, for the last 10 years, and we all know what the population's done in the last 10 years. And so I think a lot of this has to fall at the feet of the territory government to actually deal with what is a massive issue for our city. We have one of the highest rates of persistent homelessness in the country, and that I certainly feel embarrassed and a bit ashamed about that. I think most Canberrans would say we've got to do better, and that's direct investment in social housing. I think our wait list is 3,100. It's been that for a number of years now. And so looking at actually having accommodation that people can get into and be a bit more stable, but then wraparound services to help them, I guess, deal with the issues that they are facing and get back on their feet. But yeah, so much more to do there.
Do we have any more questions from in the room? There's one.
I'll add one other thing on that. The government's coming up with the new National Housing and Homelessness Agreement, which is a 10-year sort of agreement with states and territories. Myself and Kylie Tink have introduced a bill that would actually legislate a framework where you say, okay, well, every government's going to have a different way of dealing with housing and homelessness, but we can surely agree on these objectives, these principles that we want to work towards ending homelessness, that housing should be treated as a human right, and then be able to hold governments to account and say, well, how are you actually, sure, you may have your different methods of trying to get there, but how are you going when it comes to these shared objectives? So far, they don't love the idea, but we had well over 100 community housing organisations, former politicians. It's really annoying that the former party politicians always come up with these great. Are happy to support all these things that you kind of wish they'd done while they were in there. But certainly something I'm going to keep pushing. Really trying to reframe housing as take it from being an investment vehicle to something that is just fundamental, and we've got to find a way to start to turn the ship around and ensure that housing is affordable and accessible in our communities.
As a media consumer, it's really hard to understand how the transition to net zero is going, and I'm interested to know if you have perspectives on what the policy's like, but whether or not the rollout's actually happening.
Depends who you talk to. So I think that's probably part of the problem. I think to the government's credit, they've obviously given a lot more certainty by legislating a target. I don't think it's ambitious enough. But we have seen a number of, schemes that have unlocked huge demand. What I'm hearing is that projects aren't being built fast enough, and some of that comes down to approvals and all the rest. Another thing comes down to transmission, and this is obviously a pretty hot topic in regional Australia. I've been working with Helen Haynes on this, her community. It's a divisive issue. We got the government to do a independent review, and they went out and spoke to communities, and really trying to ensure that we have this transition in a way where regional Australia benefits. Not just with a pat on the back and say, oh, thanks for doing this for all of us, but in a really meaningful way with the infrastructure that they need, potentially things like cheaper power. I think that's one of the missing pieces in this. The other one is generating electricity where it's used on roofs in towns and cities, and I've been pushing the government on household electrification. Such a huge opportunity. Not only when it comes to emissions, but savings. Households could be saving thousands of dollars. And we saw the latest AEMO report. They said one of the reasons why they don't think the gas shortfall is as bad is because they're seeing bigger and bigger solar systems being put on houses. So it seems like a no-brainer to actually get more on there and get them on, warehouses and more commercial spaces. But we can potentially pull together a bit more of a, snapshot of how we're actually tracking.
Two things, David. The first one is, what's the reason the people who are stopping you from visiting public schools on our behalf are giving you? And the second one is, I just want to congratulate you on your website, where you hold yourself accountable to us as your community with the actions that you take on our behalf. And I actually think every politician or elected representative in Australia needs to learn from you on how to hold themselves accountable to their communities.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. On the first one, I think the reason is you can't make it political. But we see Labor politicians at public schools, and it's. I feel like you're letting down. A grade 7 class will say, "Can you come talk about leadership?" Or like a year 10, 11 class is studying politics, and they want to actually get a perspective. And I'd love to be able to go in and so I end up just going to non-government schools, been to a bunch of Catholic schools, private schools, which I really enjoy. But I'd love to talk to young Canberrans in public schools as well. And then, thank you. Yeah, my commitment was to be as transparent as I can with how I'm voting, and it's a lot of work for the team, but yeah, I think it's how it should be. One of the things I might actually talk to Canberrans at the next election about is I committed to putting all of my speeches on YouTube, but it takes poor old Lincoln hours and hours, and I don't think anyone watches them, so we might just put links to Hansard or something if people decide they want to re-elect me.
Just going to go over here.
Me first. Okay. David, thank you. You mentioned the EPBC Act, and that's one of my major, and because I have grandchildren, and I know a bit about biodiversity and all this sort of stuff. Probably not enough to really make great inroads in it, but it really worries me. To me, it's not just an elephant in the room, it's a bloody massive mammoth. And on the broad scale, that's probably almost too large for us to get our heads around, but I see it being constantly eaten away in Canberra itself. I see green space, no matter where it is, whether it's community owned to begin with or park. It looks as though it's a good place to develop. By develop, I mean destroy the green space and then put up houses. So there's got to be some sort of balance here, and I know infill will solve to a certain extent, but to me it really worries me that parks, can be suddenly thought, yes, open slather, we can warm up a whole heap of things. We've got to try and get some sort of balance here, because basically, and you mentioned the EPBC Act, which is the broadest act across Australia, but the ACT is not a particularly wonderful situation. It really, really bothers me. Anything you can do about it?
Yeah, it worries me too. You know, Graham Samuel, the last government got Graham Samuel to do a review of the EPBC Act, and he recently said that, you know, it should be torn up and thrown in the bin because it's a bunch of gobbledygook, and it's clearly not working. You know, we have one of the highest rates of extinction in the world, and it's not stopping the development of really important ecological communities and habitat. And yeah, here in Canberra, you know, we can point fingers at Queensland for land clearing and all the things, and you know, that's important, or down in Victoria for logging. But yeah, we're also wave or say that, you know, that Beck didn't need an environmental impact assessment, and then they called in the DA and just said, just get going. And for me, that's not good process. And I think this also really ties into a conversation around population growth and what, you know, people here in Canberra and across the country think about population growth and immigration. And my concern is that if we don't actually have a really honest and you know, informed debate about this, about how big do we want Australia to be, what does that look like for our cities, you know, is it infill? Do we keep sprawling and creating the kind of issues that we're seeing? If we don't have that debate, then you leave that debate to Pauline Hanson and others who are all too happy to tell you what they think. So it is something that I'm sort of seeking feedback from the community on, because there's clear trade-offs. The State of the Environment report highlighted population growth and sprawl as a very real threat to ecosystems across the country. Yes, we're a huge continent, but our populations are jammed into the very best land. And if you look at things like boxgum woodland, I think there's 2 or 3% left of what was here a couple hundred years ago. Temperate grasslands, I think we're down to 1%. And so these places are incredibly precious. And with climate change, it's really important that we're preserving whatever is left to allow animals to move as much as they can.
Yes, I've got the microphone. Just a very quick question. What do you think about the worsening situation in Gaza and the West Bank, and what are you planning to do from your position?
It's really, I don't know how you it's, you know, it's incredibly distressing to see what's happening over there. I've had briefings from doctors and humanitarian workers, Australians who've been over and have come back, and you know, they say it's pretty hard to actually put into words the level of sort of human suffering over there. You talk to doctors who are having to do surgery on kids without anaesthetic, and it's just sort of unthinkable for us here. The thing I've been pushing the government on is to actually have a humanitarian visa allocation that would deal with some of the sort of politicking we've seen around security checks. There are rigorous security checks when it comes to humanitarian visas, and we saw with Afghanistan there were sort of 5,000 humanitarian places. Ukraine, I think it's up around 11,000 plus now, and with Gaza we've seen 7. So I think there's a big disparity there, and I think we should just have some more consistency. So yeah, I guess it's that, and then, you know, I know the government is, you know, raising concerns, but doing whatever they can to be pushing for a permanent ceasefire and a path to peace. I've found this a really hard one to deal with because, it's on the other side of the world, and I think the reality is that Australia cannot end this conflict, but Canberrans want Australia, want the government to at least play our part as part of the international community. And for me, that is about consistency and seeing that same compassion for people who are fleeing that awful sort of situation there. And a lot of Palestinian Australians who are deeply distressed about trying to get their loved ones out.
David, thank you for your integrity. Two things that really worry me. One is aged care, and aged care is in crisis. And I would like to see adequate staffing to allow people who wish to stay in their homes and have the services, the quality services delivered to their homes in Canberra. It's something I'm very passionate about. Secondly is migration. We cannot function unless we have adequate, we have skilled staff, and we don't have staff doing the work that's required. So we need a healthy and appropriate migration problem issue, a solution. And we also need, you can't just stop international students from coming here. Our universities are about to crash, and they will crash if there are no international students. They pay a hell of a lot of money to come here, and we then use them in whatever form, or they return to their countries. So migration is big, and it has to be handled appropriately. Otherwise, our country, the backbone of this country has been built on multicultural. The people have worked hard and over the years, and we have a healthy economy and a hugely strong infrastructure built by multicultural people. So I'd like to continue that by giving people who are from different countries the ability to study here and then integrate into the society if they wish to. So this really needs to be looked at in a very careful manner, and aged care, don't forget that. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I think, to your point, one of the things that the government's working on, but I still don't think we've got it quite right, is actually having a really targeted sort of list of skills that we do need. The government's draft list, there were no tradies, but yoga instructors were on there. And it kind of does, I also enjoy doing yoga, but it seems in terms of priorities, they need to look at that. The Aged Care Act, as I said, they've committed to a full rewriting. We've seen the issues with star ratings, with lack of staff in residential aged care. And so I know that's sort of a negotiation, and once we have the details, I'll be going out to consult with Canberrans and providers here and see what they think. The residential piece, I think, is an incredibly important one. I'm looking at Rory. Rory on my team. We've done a lot of work at estimates, trying to actually dig into why people in the ACT are waiting so much longer for assessments. What are the figures, Raw? So people in the ACT are waiting up to 12 months just for an assessment to be able to stay in their home. And then another year to get the package. And the reason I've been pushing this is because the federal government actually gives the ACT funding to employ people to do these assessments. And I know that they're really cranky at the ACT government because despite giving them money to do that, they still haven't seen that. And last time I was at estimates, they said, well, actually, we think it's going to get worse before it gets better, and people will be waiting longer. And you'd know just how critical it is that people get the assessment and they're actually able to stay. And it's better for everyone. So yeah, we'll certainly keep pushing that.
I just wanted to ask your opinion on gambling, both the advertising and also pokies. I came to Canberra a bit over 10 years ago, and two things struck me. One, not initially, but it built the amount of online gambling that's advertised. It's just in your face non-stop. And I come from Melbourne, and I don't recall that sort of being the case there, maybe now. The other was the pokies, which Canberra's very different to Melbourne, and a lot of the eating out takes place in clubs. A lot of those clubs, which clearly an ACT government matter, are open as late as 4 in the morning, and if you go in there in the early hours of the morning, the lights are out, there's hardly any staff, there's a small handful of what are obviously problem gamblers. Why they even have a permit to be open is beyond me. But I view it as a public health issue. There was a terrible battle with cigarettes, and I wonder whether or not you see it as a public health issue. And although it's not a straight parallel, if a very aggressive approach could be taken, similar to what happened with cigarettes.
Thank you. I'll talk about the online first. So the late Peter Murphy, she was a Labor MP, and she chaired a committee that was looking at online gambling, and they said, absolutely, this is a public health issue, and it requires a response akin to what we did with cigarettes. And they said a full ban, phased-in ban over 3 years of all online gambling advertising. So that's social media, online ads, TV, streaming services. Then they had another 30 recommendations that went to sort of harmonisation. They had a levy on gambling companies to actually pay for some of the programs to work with problem gamblers. Really comprehensive. From what we've been briefed on by the government, they're not going to go through with that. They want sort of an hour before and after sport and a few little tweaks. We know that partial bans don't work, and so I'm really worried that we're getting policy in this space that's not good for all of us, but is good for gambling companies, and you can argue maybe for media companies. But I think if we're going to look after the media, let's not prop them up with gambling revenue. On pokies, yeah, obviously squarely an ACT issue. There was a really fascinating question in Slido, the bottom one there, the Norwegian model of dealing with pokies, black and white display, no sounds, no colours. It sounds like a pretty good step to me. I've actually been to a couple of forums where Labor and the Greens, sort of local spokespeople, have had some pretty entertaining sort of back and forth. I think this is an issue for them to try and sort out, but we don't seem to be getting the kind of progress that I think a lot of people would want to actually minimise harms. Because you're right, it's a small number of people losing an extraordinary amount of money, and no one's suggesting that no one should be allowed to gamble. But how do you take that public health approach and look after people who need the help? So I don't know. Are there any MLAs, or at least candidates? I think there's a bunch of candidates. You put your hands up. Yep. So there's some candidates for the local ACT election. I reckon it's worth talking to them. But you talk to Tim Costello, and clearly Labor have a problem when it comes to pokies. Yeah, so the point was that they're not willing to tackle the gambling industry like they did the cigarette industry. I wasn't around back then, but I've talked to a bunch of advocates who said, that sort of took 20 years to really get to the point where it was like, well, you have to do something about this. And some courage. Yeah, I don't think we have 20 years when it comes to online gambling, and people have had a gutful. And so that's the thing I don't understand, is where you have a majority of Australians wanting reform, why is there not the political, surely it's not even courage, it's just listening, just actually doing what's good for us. But we'll certainly keep pushing them on it.
We're just down here, and then we'll come to you, Greg.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to raise concerns about emissions abatement, and I'm glad to hear that we're aiming for net zero by 2050. That's all great. I'm just concerned that we're having politicians stand up, announce how many tonnes of CO2 are going to be abated, and there's no costing that's part of that. announcement. So we're kind of being led down this line of we're going to get all this abatement, ticking boxes, but at the end of the day, to me, double glazing, electric vehicles, all these other ways that we're abating emissions, that we're going to have to abate the emissions, not necessarily government or industry, we're not getting any costing out of that or what the impacts will be. Having come from Sydney, I know that we got all these wonderful toll roads when they opened, but now we're paying the price of the tolls now. So I'm concerned about the future in terms of pricing there.
I mean, clearly if you look at the whole abatement issue, there's some really strong modelling that shows that, yes, the transition is going to be expensive, but inaction will be 10 times more expensive down the track. And so I guess you raise valid concerns about, well, what does that transition look like and who does pay the price? You know, if all of us go home and put in double glazing at the cost of, I don't know, 30 or 40 grand and buy an EV and do everything, and yet the government continues to allow all these big new gas projects to come online, from Beetaloo to Browse to, you know, the Northwest Shelf, Scarborough. What's the point, really? And so I think we have to do it all, and we have to get the government to be serious about it. And you know, I would love to see them actually raise something like the petroleum resource rent tax. So we're actually getting money for our gas, and that could go to sort of abatement measures that also benefit households when it comes to cost savings of living in a more energy efficient house, of not having to pay, you know, $1.96 for petrol. I think there are opportunities there, but yeah, I hear what you're saying about the cost and what that means for people. And I think particularly as households begin to electrify more and more, it's going to be lower income houses, renters, people in social housing who, if we don't have the right policy in place, will be left behind because they can't afford that upfront cost. And so this is something I'm pushing the government on, is to actually run a series of accelerator projects where you actually try and work out all these harder problems. What are the incentives that are needed? What's the sort of finance arrangements for different people?
Down here, David.
Oh, we've still got more. Hello.
Hi, just two issues I wanted to hear your thoughts on. First of all, with the recently announced caps on international student enrolment,
Sorry, I didn't talk about that. Yep.
Yeah. What can we do to ensure that universities will either be regulated by government or be able to self-regulate effectively so that we can continue to have fair rules around international enrolment while having universities remain financially viable? And the second issue was, I think we've heard a lot of talk since the last election from the government on action they're taking to lower the catastrophic rates of domestic violence, particularly for First Nations women and women all around the country. And what can you do to improve the government's response to the crisis? Thanks.
Great questions. So on the universities, government's got this bill to limit higher education numbers to what they were pre-pandemic. You talk to universities and their funding has been either steady or decreasing. They're having to do more with less. And the government essentially said, we're not going to fund you like we used to, particularly when it comes to research. You know, we've got the lowest rate of R&D funding as a percentage of GDP in our history. And so universities have said, okay, well, let's make a plan. Let's get international students, charge exorbitant fees that they're willing to pay, and then actually cross-subsidise some domestic places, cross-subsidise research, put it into infrastructure. And so we've got to this point where we're seeing more and more students. And you know, I think in all of this, there are some very valid concerns and conversations that need to be had about, you know, the ratio of international students to local students in, say, a class, and what that means for the quality of the the learning experience, but to come in with caps after after universities have actually given offers out just seems pretty outrageous to me. And so I would love to see a sort of a longer or medium-term plan to actually deal with things like on-campus accommodation, and have a discussion about what should the ratios at universities be, both in terms of overall numbers in classes, how do we cater to that, and how do we actually start funding research so universities aren't so reliant on international students. I'm honestly not sure where this bill will go. I know that they're trying to get bipartisan support for it, which obviously means that the crossbench can't stop it, or potentially doesn't have as much leverage. But we've been engaging a lot with local universities and universities across the country. And one of the really poor things about this piece of legislation is that they don't recognise any on-campus accommodation that you have, only what you build in the future. And if you look at UC and the ANU, they've invested a huge amount over the last decade on campus accommodation, and they're saying, well, why shouldn't that actually be acknowledged in this bill? So there's a range of things that we're trying to work on to, I guess, make it a bit fairer. Your second question was, domestic violence. Gosh, so much more. This sector came together and did some work looking at what that would cost, and they said it probably cost about $1 billion a year if you were going to fund not just crisis services, but actually sort of early intervention services, and then I think really importantly some behaviour change services working with young men mostly. And my experience has been across the board, you talk to organisations in that space and they just don't have the funding to work with men. They're flat out working with women and children who are trying to flee domestic violence situations. So I think there's a huge amount that could be done. It obviously starts with funding of those services, but the rapid review that the government did, some of the things that they talked about was, surprise, surprise, banning gambling advertising in terms of harm minimisation, looking at things like opening hours of bottle shops, really strong correlation when they increase opening hours with domestic violence. So I think that's what makes it hard for the government to think really fully deal with. They're committing to ending, domestic violence in a generation. If they're going to do that, you've actually got to have this across the board response where you're looking at things like alcohol. How do we, what do you do that? But then you're coming up against very big industries. But there's some amazing advocates in this space in the ACT, and we're sort of working with them to push locally and federally to try and just get more ambition. This is something that Australians want our government to be turning their mind to. Thanks, Cash.
Hello, David. Thank you for the excellent work you do in the Parliament. Just wanted to thank you, and also your staff. They do a great job.
They're amazing.
Yeah, indeed. Look, I just wondering. I was wondering about do we in the ACT get fair share of funding from the federal government? There is a perception out there in the public out there that this is being safe labor seat, so we don't really get enough funding. Like I'm wondering, the light rail is one example. I really don't know we get any federal funding. There's one particularly I'm interested is actually we need a multicultural center. Mm-hmm. There's a few people spoke about the migrant community. It's growing. We have Theo Notaris, which was built, 40, 50 years ago. It's outdated, not big enough. This was an election promise in the local ACT elections last term, and they haven't delivered one yet. Is this something you could look at in the next round? Is it actually comes under the federal, and is it something would you mind looking at in the next round? Thank you, David.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. There's actually a pot of federal money that I think a multicultural centre sort of fits all the terms of. And Fiona's been talking to someone who writes grant applications, and will be reaching out with people who've been working on it. One of my frustrations has been that there are all these sort of buckets of federal money, and too often when I ask at estimates, they say, "Oh, well, the ACT government hasn't put in a bid," and so I think we've really got to change that, because we aren't getting our share of infrastructure money. You know, we got $100 million for light rail, but I think only 50 million of that is actually budgeted for in the next 4 years. So I'm not sure how that works, but we're not, and I'm keen to see that addressed. Every time I say it's because we've got safe Labor seats, I get a lot of pushback from my Labor colleagues in there, unsurprisingly. But I mean, I'm going to keep pushing this, because I think we've got to change this, and we've got to change this perception that Canberra is somehow just this bubble. We're a city in our own right, and we should have investment in infrastructure that's going to, not just meet our needs, but actually set us up for the future. But yeah, let's touch base about the multicultural centre.
Thanks so much, David. I was wondering, especially with your background in sport, I thought it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on what you think the role of the federal government and state government should be in better supporting women's sport. So I don't know if you've followed very much, but here in the ACT, it basically took donations from the public to save Canberra United, which is quite staggering. And then there's so much research about the widening participation gap, especially through adolescence, more girls dropping out. I think we often see sort of short-term hype and gestures around big ticket events like a World Cup final or something like that, but it's never sustained, and the systemic issues remain. And so I was wondering what you think it would take to get long-term change, and with what you mentioned about the kind of reframing and looking at housing and treating it as a human right, I was sort of thinking if, in this field, if we need a basic commitment where the government says that we're going to treat it and look at it through a gender equality lens instead of allowing things to be stifled by misleading statistics and claims about the women not being marketable or the women not being good enough, which I think actually women are continuing to blow those stats out of the park, but we keep on kind of using those objections. So what do you think the role of each government should be?
That's a great question, and I think the Women's World Cup sort of highlighted one, just how far, I guess, women's sport has come in terms of being able to reach a global audience, but I think showing that Australians want to get behind it. And you talk to local football clubs that have seen a 400% increase in their girls teams, and just don't have enough fields. And that's something that I hear across the board, whether you're talking to basketball, ACT, or football. There's not enough community sporting facilities for our growing city. And at a time where we're talking about loneliness and health issues and all these things, you'd think that, community sport kind of helps with all of those things, and it should be accessible and I think affordable for any young person or anyone who wants to play community sport. Then on top of that, when you actually look at those facilities across the ACT, far too many of them don't have women's change rooms. And you have situations where the women are getting changed. They're either not able to get changed or they're getting changed. And I know for a while at Uni North, they were getting changed in a shipping container before games until the uni upgraded the change rooms. I met with the sports minister about Canberra United, and her response was, well, this is squarely a territory issue. After the Football World Cup, they set aside, I think, 250 million for the women's sport investment fund. I forget what they called it. I'm not sure if any money's actually been spent, but that wasn't just football. That was across the board, and 250 million bucks across the country is not going to go that far. So I would love to see more investment in this. There's this real live debate in Parliament around the effect that mobile phones and sort of this screen-based childhood is having on our young people. And there's people saying, well, we could be we should be banning social media for people under 14, under 16. I think that conversation is something that needs to be had. But you cannot do that without actually investing more in playgrounds and community sport and places where young people can actually go and hang out and challenge themselves. It seems like a no-brainer to me. I may be a bit biased as a former rugby player, but would love to see a lot more actual investment, not just lip service and politicians wanting the photo op, but not actually investing in the facilities.
Hi, David. I speak softly. Yeah. A comment first, and then a question. The concept of a safe seat of any kind, I think, is outdated. And the question is, if the speculators are correct about the likelihood of a hung parliament in the next election, what do we say to the people who say that voting for an independent is wasting your vote? And have you had time to think about how a more powerful crossbench would provide better governance for us?
I think we're going to see a real scare campaign from both major parties. I think it's going to be a real feature of this campaign, this sort of talk about, minority government, what would that mean? You've just got to look to the Nordic countries, look to Europe, a lot of functioning democracies. What I've seen in the Senate is when the opposition don't support something and they actually have to negotiate with the crossbench, it may take a little bit longer, but you get far better policy. You actually, I think, get policy that is more robust, takes into account a lot more consultation, is more evidence-based. And I think will actually last longer, some of the reform that's happened. We hopefully won't see this kind of seesaw where Labor and Libs, they get into power and then they try and undo everything that's been done. My sense is there's a big chunk of Australians who just want the Parliament to get on with it. And I've seen that happen when there is that negotiation. I mean, the thing I'd try to say to people is I think a minority government actually unlocks huge opportunity when it comes to things like cost of living and housing. Having some sort of way forward when it comes to tax reform on investment properties. Senator Jackie Lambie and I got a whole bunch of scenarios modelled by the Parliamentary Budget Office. Everything from sort of just grandfathering and having no negative gearing going forward to having one maybe two properties. There's a range of ways that we could actually deal with this. And I think a minority government, you'd be able to potentially push for things like that. I think being a bit more ambitious on climate change. There was a question here about the big four banks. Like, competition is something that is just disgraceful in Australia. You look at airlines, banks, supermarkets, and we're all paying the price of that. And I think you would see independents saying, okay, let's actually talk about these issues that have been in the too hard basket for too long now. But we'll see what Australians think, whenever the election happens.
G'day. There's a lot of housing policy at the moment, which is great, but I find that, and I've tried to get the ACT government to change their rules around tiny houses on wheels. There's an industry around that already. There's a representative body. It seems like a no-brainer for them to change the rules around that. Is there any way for the federal government to sort of encourage the other levels of government to change their rules?
I don't think there is directly. Yeah, I mean, this is something that's been raised with me. That there are ways where they can add some conditionality to funding. Obviously, there's billions of dollars that flow to the states and territories, and it's possible for them to say, okay, well, you'll get this if you do this. And I think Senator Andrew Bragg from the Libs was saying that this morning on Insiders, that there should be more pressure on states and territories and in the states on councils to actually deal with some of these issues. But it makes sense to me if people want to live in a tiny house to actually find a way to make that possible. One of the other things that's been raised is not being able to get a mortgage on like really small studio apartments, and so they just don't get built. I think there's all sorts of solutions that aren't for everyone, but I think they're part of it. But again, maybe talk to someone who's actually running.
Hello. Thanks, David. You're doing a great job. You mentioned you're interested in scams. I assume combating them, not perpetrating them. But would you like to talk about how we can get justice from, say, the banks, which have, as you say, obscene profits, and yet they don't seem to be doing anything about combating scams? Thanks.
Well, if you talk to them, they say they're doing a huge amount. The government promised legislation on this. I actually met with the Assistant Treasurer last sitting week to sort of say, well, where is this legislation? And my understanding is that the legislation would set up a framework to actually get the banks and others to start investing more. I don't think they're proposing, say what the UK's done, which really puts it on the banks to recover costs after scams. I'd be interested to see what people think about the different models that are are out there. The government's also looking at ways to have, easier ways to report. I got one this morning, this random text saying that I had a message on my GovID with some bizarre website. There should be a way to actually investigate that number, and I think they're talking about actually flipping the from having a blacklist where you get added to this, to saying if you're actually going to do mass text outs, you have to be on this list or it's illegal. And so I think that will be a good change. But again, no legislation yet. So that'll be a start. But it's talking to scam experts, they say, artificial intelligence is going to totally change because they will be able to target the scam to you. They'll know everything about you, then they'll be able to really... And I guess we're already seeing that. People these scams that are going months and months and months and months, and then they finally get someone. And so certainly more needs to be done. I'm also pushing the banks to do this because I asked a question in question time and said to the minister, are the banks getting to you? Are they lobbying against this? And within minutes we had calls from the banks saying it wasn't the case. So I said, okay, well let's come out together and call for legislation. So we'll see what happens.
Senator, hello, and
Hello.
Thank you so much for the hope you've given the ACT. I think back to the last election and all the frustration we had collectively, and clearly good things have happened. And
there's surely still frustration.
Need to hold on to what is good. A couple of questions from me. One is around, of course, there were a whole lot of issues and structural things that we took to the election, or you took and many others, and one was about integrity, how we do politics. I wonder what's happened to 4-year terms to create the kind of momentum we want to see for long-term change and policy that works, that harvests wisdom for the common good. So 4-year terms, has there been any conversation about that? And 2, related to the earlier question around artificial intelligence, what sort of guarantee can we have as citizens going into an election about the use or otherwise of AI? Can we have any real confidence that people who use it for ill will be held accountable? How will we be targeted potentially? Are we thinking about just how this campaign can be really quite ugly given the possibilities of that tool?
I'd be interested here, just show of hands, if you would support 4-year terms. Yeah. I mean, it's been a real eye-opener for me being in there and sort of seeing the phases, you know, the first 6 months where I think they were kind of just trying to work out what they were doing, and then they did some stuff, and it's now just sort of purely election focused. And yeah, 4-year terms make a lot of sense. Would require another referendum, but it's surely the kind of thing you could get bipartisan support for. You'd think, and potentially just have another ballot paper in a general election, federal election. So there hasn't been a lot of talk about it, to be honest. Okay, but yeah, that's a clear majority there. On AI, 0 rules, absolutely no assurances. I was asking the head of the Tom Rogers, the head of the Australian Electoral Commission. They're not in our laws. Our laws do not deal with artificial intelligence at all. Come elections, they don't deal with truth in political advertising. If you have a authorization at the end, the sped up authorized by David Pocock, say what you want. And so that's something I'm pushing the government on. We've had all of our federal elections without AI. We can surely go another one without AI. And I think we should just rule it out. Particularly when it comes to deep fakes and voice clones. We've seen them used in South Korea. They've been used in the Indian election recently. In the US, you had fake robocalls from Joe Biden telling people not to come out and vote. So this is happening, and the AEC said that they absolutely expect it'll happen in our federal election. During COVID, within 2 weeks, the major parties passed laws to allow people to vote over the phone. So if there's the political will, it can happen, and it's something that I'll be pushing them on and hoping to do a bit more in the next sitting weeks. But yeah, can keep people updated on that.
Just a quick question. I'm a former manager of a department at the National Convention Centre, and this sort of pairs in with the infrastructure sort of topics we were talking about before. And one of the things that maybe a lot of the ACT residents maybe don't know is that the convention centre is actually a real hub of activity. Given our close proximity to federal government departments, we would hold a lot of events all throughout the year. We were making a considerable amount of money, but the problem was that our venue wasn't big enough, and so we were actually limited as to the sort of events that we could get to come to the National Convention Centre in comparison to other capital cities. I'm sure this sort of pairs in with the stadium as well. How do you sort of also feel about the recent costings that were announced for, potentially what a stadium might cost to build? And do you think that it's a good investment for the future, considering how many events we might potentially miss out on by not having the venues that are up to a standard that are sort of high enough in order to hold these events?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of my frustrations with the stadium debate is that every time I speak to journalists, I talk about the convention centre and stadium, and they just talk about the stadium because people want to talk about a stadium. But the business case for the convention centre, it's a total no-brainer, and we've done a bunch of work with them and the tourism leaders forum, I think that's what they called, and looking at just how much we're missing out on as just a city of what we could be bringing here, but then as a capital city, not actually being able to host big events that other capitals around the world can host. So again, frustratingly, we've known this for, was it 2002, Tom? 2001 or 2, they decided that the convention centre couldn't host CHOGM anymore. and we've kind of known since then, well, we've got to probably do something about this as the national capital. We still don't have a plan for it, which is really frustrating. And yeah, we're seeing these sort of cost blowouts and increases in construction costs, and I don't think that's gonna change. The longer we leave these things, the more expensive they're gonna become, and the more we miss out as a city. So I would love to see a plan from the ACT government, a vision for the future, saying we're going to build this. This will be big enough for the next 40 years, and then let's go to the federal government and ask for some sort of co-funding to make that happen. But I'm just not seeing that sort of, I don't know, vision and actually getting a plan together at the moment, frustratingly. Yeah.
Hi, David. My question is about the environment. When the IPCC said we kind of need to turn our attention not away from mitigation, but certainly to look more at adaptation. One of the issues that I'm very passionate about is invasive species, and it seems frequently that a lot of the work in that area gets thrown at environmental volunteers instead of there being really any funding coming into that area. I know I spoke with Sam a while back about it, and you know, the red ants get some funding, so that's really great, but there's not a lot of federal funding. What I'm wondering about is more and more with adaptation, if there's an angle on it so that people can see that invasive species are actually one of the major factors in especially bushfires. So our bushfires are caused by invasive plants that they, not caused, but certainly like Maui and other instances where they were a major factor in the catastrophe. If the federal government could be encouraged to actually act in that respect, since biodiversity may not be getting through to them, maybe the fact that people are so concerned about bushfire might be a way to get them to act on invasive plants, for example. What are your thoughts on that?
Now you're talking. I could talk about invasives for hours. There's one of the biggest threats to biodiversity in Australia. We've obviously a mega diverse country, incredible biodiversity that has evolved without, you know, a lot of these placental mammals like cats and foxes, and then you look at fire ants, yellow crazy ants, some of the buffel grass. What's the score? All right. And you talk to people working in those various fields, and you see these sort of funding, you know, cats will be the new thing. We've got a war on cats, and they'll wage a war for 3 years, and then you kind of forget about it, and then the cats breed back up, and 20 years later you'll have another war on cats. And I think you can do that for each thing. There isn't a consistent level of funding, and that's something I've been pushing the government on, is to actually provide that certainty of long-term funding to start to tackle these threats. I quite like your idea about trying to make it about things, say, like bushfires that affect all of us, but we need to really step up because it's a huge threat. And so I think there's the year-on-year funding, and then I think there's also the potential to invest in some really amazing Australian researchers who are looking at sort of game-changing solutions. So if you look at things like cane toads or cats or rabbits, things like gene drive technology, where you can edit the gene of, say, a cat, and it's only going to have male offspring. And over time, it's sort of a far more humane way of actually getting rid of feral cats. CSIRO has done some work on that. There's others at universities, but again, there's no funding for it. So I think, yeah, huge opportunity, and happy to talk more a bit later on.
I
think we're just going to do one last question. I'm sorry, folks, and then we'll wrap up.
Thanks, David. Listening here, it sounds like as a nation we've reached a point where we're hemorrhaging in so many areas, and basically all government does is put band-aids on the hemorrhages. And I think it comes back to the narrative that has been constructed around government for the last 30 years, that small government is good government, that private is better than public, that low tax is a goal, where even if we've got and that we're a high taxing nation, where in fact if we got up to the OECD average, it's estimated we'd have an extra $100 billion a year so that we could fund all the programs that you're talking about. You know, I know independents are there trying to reconstruct a different narrative, but how can we start to build that? I think there is some momentum there that, you know, we do believe in the role of government, therefore we're going to govern well, and we do believe that the role of the public sector is critical to us achieving the goals that we want as a nation.
I mean, I think you're spot on with that, and one of the challenges is this public narrative around tax cuts, and when you have so many Australians doing it tough because of a failure to actually address the root causes of a whole range of things, from housing to a lack of competition, where you see insurance costs and everything go up. People go, well, yeah, tax cut, you beauty. That's what I want. But I think the way I think about it is you actually have to go up a level and start to talk about, well, what are the services and kind of things that we value as a community when it comes to health and education, and how do we pay for that? What is the sort of fair share? And what we do see in Australia is because we're basically happy to ship off our gas for free. I think like something like half of our gas pays no royalty or petroleum resource rent tax, that Australians do pay a high sort of percentage of our total tax through personal income tax. And you'll hear people say, well, the way to solve that is to reduce personal income tax. The flip side is, well, let's actually levy a bit more on our natural resources, which belong to all of us. And then, yeah, we could be paying for these things. But it's a pretty hard debate to have in there, because there is this obsession around tax cuts. And it's kind of this, and I don't think some people in the media help at all, where that is the thing we need to do. Oh, we're struggling. Okay, we need to cut taxes. And I think, yes, if you do look at other countries, you look at the Nordic countries, the level of sort of services that they're able to provide, the indicators around well-being, a whole range of things, inequality. Some of them are doing a lot better than we are. But yeah, if you've got ideas around the narrative and how we change that, I'd love to chat more, because it's, yeah. 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 And you know, we see this play out in budgets. Budgets to me that are about, you know, you've got all the rhetoric about, you know, what we stand for and what we care about. The budget is in black and white. These are our priorities as a country. This is where we're putting money, and they still don't line up with what I hear from people and what they want invested in, and the direction that we're heading in as a country. And so I think there's a lot of work to go there to actually make that budget work for us and invest in the future, rather than just shore up votes for the next election.
So we've just about hit 5:30, so we'll wrap up for the night. The next town hall will be at the end of the year, so maybe just keep checking in on the website to keep in touch with what's going on next. But we're really keen to continue the conversation. So we'll all move out to the barbecue area, and you can grab anybody in a Team Pocock shirt or have a chat with David. And we've got a couple of special things going on. Electrify Canberra are outside. They've cooked up a barbecue to fundraise for their great work. So if you'd like to grab something to eat, please do that. And then we've got a tour with the Eastern Betong, who is resident at Wildbark. So some of you have booked. If you haven't booked and you'd like to come along, please just grab one of us outside and we can sort that out for you. But those tours will start from out near the barbecue as well. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all so much for coming along. Really appreciate it. And please, can you just give Tash and my team a round of applause? They are truly incredible.